what Galadriel and Celeborn were getting up to during the madness of the First Age? Like, what role did they play in the latter parts of the Silmarillion? Well, turns out that perfectly reasonable question is considerably trickier to answer than one might expect. Maya, Govan and Melanin, and welcome to the first episode in this new series explaining and breaking down Tolkien's epic First Age tale of the Silmaril of Doriath, which can kind of be thought of as Tolkien's lost tale. In the next episode, I'll get stuck into the plot of that story and the conflict and the epic events that defined the fate of this great elvish kingdom. But first, in this episode, I want to explain what exactly I mean when I describe this tale as lost. On the one hand, it's not really lost at all. In chapter 22 of the Silmarillion, we get a short account detailing most of the events that I'm going to spend the rest of this series explaining. However, half of that short chapter is concerned solely with the wanderings of Húrin, which is what I talked about in the last series. And so, the story of Doriath really is confined to just under 6.5 pages. So much happens, but it's so sparsely told. For a bit of perspective, the tale of Fëanor covers around 60 pages, and the tale of Turin Turambar gets its own 250-page book. But there is a reason why this story is so much shorter. When Tolkien died, he left the Quenta Silmarillion, the great tales of the First Age, unfinished. After the success of The Lord of the Rings, he worked hard to revise the Silmarillion and to turn it into a cohesive self-contained narrative that the average Lord of the Rings fan could really sink their teeth into. Effectively, this was going to be the story, more so than even The Hobbit, that The Lord of the Rings would serve as a sequel to. And for the most part, Tolkien did succeed. The published Silmarillion is phenomenal. But it was published 4 years after he died. And as I mentioned in the previous series, when he got to the trial of Húrin Thalion in the Forest of Brethil and the death of his friend and kinsman Manthor at the hand of the woodman Avrunk, Tolkien just sort of stopped. He worked on many other things and he gave us many other fascinating writings, but he never finished an updated First Age post The Lord of the Rings. When Tolkien died, the last 3 chapters of the Silmarillion still needed work. They existed as fragments, but not as full stories. And that is where Christopher Tolkien, the professor's youngest son, comes into the picture. He edited the Silmarillion. He took his father's notes and writings, and he made them into the publishable book that we fantasy fans enjoy so much. But what Christopher Tolkien did not do was fill in any of the blanks. He could have added his own inventions, he could have created new characters and new events to flesh out the latter chapters in whatever way he wanted to, but he didn't. Such was his commitment to his father's work and his integrity as a chronicler rather than a storyteller. As I've said a few times before, despite the fact that Professor Tolkien died before completing the Silmarillion, still, pretty much all of it was written by him. There are no great sections that Christopher Tolkien made up or tried to pass off as his father's. That's part of why I respect him so much. However, there is a reason why I say pretty much all, and not absolutely all. And that reason is this chapter. Almost all of it comes directly from Tolkien's older writings, but there are 1 or 2 details that we know must have happened for this story to make sense, but Tolkien never actually wrote down, at least not in any manuscript that Christopher Tolkien had access to. It is a wonderful story, and I am super excited to start telling it, but I must state right away, this chapter, this event in Middle-earth's First Age history, is the one for which we have the least evidence. What we have instead is an aggregate of everything Christopher was able to compile from his father's scattered notes and papers, and 1 or 2 other details that he was forced to eke out himself. But Christopher did not embark on this quest alone. He recruited a young Canadian student in his early 20s to assist him with the compiling process, and this young man's name was Guy Gavriel Kay. At the time, he was chosen for the task because he had some connection to Christopher's wife, who is also Canadian, but since then, he has gone on to become a great fantasy and historical author in his own right, and he remains greatly beloved and respected by many, many readers all around the world. It's kind of a crazy fun fact about him that before all of that, he assisted Professor Tolkien's son in assembling the Silmarillion. He offered a few suggestions, and he proposed a couple of solutions to problems arising in the making of a composite narrative. And this is the story where most of those problems arose. Christopher and Guy had nothing more to work from than the sketchiest outline. But with that outline, they were able to arrange and organise those 6.5 pages into the latter half of chapter 22, which tells the great tale that I am calling the Silmaril of Doriath, the epic story that the whole rest of this series, the next 7 episodes, are going to be all about explaining. However, for the rest of this episode, I want to speculate on one of the most important things that isn't in that chapter. Something I feel certainly would have been included if Tolkien had lived a little longer and written a little more, but that Christopher Tolkien was conscientious enough as an editor not to invent and embed within his father's work. What about Galadriel and Celeborn? You know, quite important characters. In the published Silmarillion, Galadriel plays a major role at first. She is the niece of the great and powerful super elf Lord Fëanor. Back in Valinor, she was the inspiration for the titular Silmarils. She was a leader in her uncle's rebellion until she turned against him at a crucial moral moment and stood in defense of her mother's kin. She joined her brother Fëanor and went with him to Doriath, where she met her great-uncle on her mother's side, another super elf, High King of the Sindar Thingol, and in Doriath she also met one of his kinsmen, Lord Celeborn, her future husband. Then she went to a feast in Nargothrond, she chatted with her brother a little bit about why he's not married yet, and then, well, that's as far as Tolkien got in weaving his new character of Galadriel, who did not exist in his imagination until he was writing The Lord of the Rings in the 1940s, into the much older writings of the First Age that preceded all of that, the early Silmarillion. In the first half of the published Silmarillion, Galadriel is set up as a relatively young supporting character who appears to be on the road to redemption following her role in and then subsequent total disavowal of her uncle's unjust rebellion. She parts ways with the violent cousins that she once stood alongside, the sons of Fëanor, and instead she gets adopted into the extended family on her mother's side. We are told she becomes a pupil of Doriath's divine queen, Melian the Maya, from whom she learns the art of baking lembas and the basics of how to become a super elvish lady of a guarded elvish realm deep in the woods with a tall silver-haired lord of the Sindar for a husband. In fact, one could suggest Tolkien was probably drawing direct inspiration from the pre-existing characters of Melian and Thingol when he wrote Galadriel and Celeborn into The Lord of the Rings. And speaking of Celeborn, he's an important player too. In the Silmarillion, we are told that he is a prince of Doriath and a kinsman of Thingol's. We're not told specifically how he relates to the High King of the Sindar, but in later writings, found in the Unfinished Tales, we are explicitly told that he was the grandson of Thingol's youngest brother, a shadowy figure called Elmo, or Star Person. Presumably, Elmo was also a prince of Doriath, but nothing much is known about him save that he was well loved by Thingol, he dwelt with Thingol in Doriath, and he had a son called Galadon, Thingol's nephew. Many years later, Galadon had 2 sons of his own, the elder of whom was our guy Celeborn, and the younger was called Galathiel, Celeborn's little brother. Now, the reason Galathiel matters is because he had a daughter called Nimloth, and Nimloth will go on to be quite a significant character in this story about the Silmaril of Doriath. She will also go on to be the direct ancestor of a lot of important characters in the Second and Third Ages. And she is the niece of Lord Celeborn. It's hard for me to imagine Nimloth's story without my mind wandering over to her uncle and her aunt by marriage, even though neither Celeborn nor Galadriel are ever mentioned in the chapter in which Nimloth features. I should point out, in the Nature of Middle-earth, we are specifically told that although Galadriel and Celeborn were betrothed in Doriath, they didn't actually tie the knot until a time of peace in the very early Second Age. So at the time of this story, they would have been in love, but not actually married. Anyway, I suppose for the sake of giving the full picture, I should also point out that in the Fellowship of the Ring, where Tolkien first came up with Galadriel and Celeborn long before he tried to go back and fit them into the Silmarillion, we are given a slightly different account of what they got up to in the First Age. In Lothlorien, Galadriel tells Frodo, "Ere the fall of Nargothrond or Gondolin, I passed over the mountains, away from Beleriand." Which would mean at some point, before the middle of Turin Turambar's story, Galadriel peaced out of Beleriand and had nothing to do with any further action in the First Age. But that is one of the first things Tolkien ever wrote about her. It's in a book that has nothing to do with either Nargothrond or Gondolin, and I would suggest the reason why Tolkien wrote that line has more to do with evoking how ancient Galadriel truly is, rather than committing wholeheartedly to some specific First Age backstory for her. Because after publishing The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien wrote many new things about Galadriel's backstory, and those later writings quite clearly contradict what she tells Frodo in Lothlorien. In fact, even in the Lord of the Rings appendices, we are told that Celeborn did not cross the mountains until after the First Age, and this is backed up in the Unfinished Tales, where we're told that he passed into Eriador early in the Second Age, which would mean he was still very much in Beleriand during the First. Furthermore, in another part of the Unfinished Tales, we are told that Galadriel's kinship with Thingol proved of great importance later in Beleriand. But if she departed Beleriand before the fall of Nargothrond, that really would not be true. She would have had no importance whatsoever in Beleriand. Which brings us to my subjective opinion. I think Galadriel and Celeborn's characters are simply more interesting if we choose to imagine that they were still dwelling in Doriath during the events of this coming story, rather than imagining them as wandering through empty lands and contributing next to nothing to the narrative. Christopher Tolkien himself wrote, "It is a natural assumption that Celeborn and Galadriel were present at the events of the story." I don't want to spoil anything. "It is said in one place that Celeborn escaped," one I'm going to talk about over the next few episodes, "and perhaps aided the escape of the Silmaril." But this is nowhere stated. I suppose I should also point out, towards the very end of Tolkien's life, he radically changed his conception of Galadriel and Celeborn again. In fact, potentially the very last thing he ever wrote, days before his death, was a new version of their story, in which Celeborn was not a Sindar, but was instead one of the Teleri from Valinor. In that version, Galadriel is presented much less like the character we know and love from other writings, and much more like a perfect sort of Virgin Mary, Immaculate Conception, free of sin kind of figure. His last writings were much more philosophical than story-based, and in those last conceptions, both Galadriel and Celeborn were removed entirely from any kinds of misdeeds or wrongdoing. They had nothing to do with the Noldor's rebellion, and they're both morally perfect, really, in every way. Clearly, this directly contradicts pretty much everything we're told about them in The Lord of the Rings, and in the Silmarillion, and in the Unfinished Tales. The vast majority of what we know about Galadriel and Celeborn's backstory can be found in a fascinating chapter of the Unfinished Tales called The History of Galadriel and Celeborn. But the very first paragraph of that chapter is crucial in understanding why their story is so complex. In the exact words of Christopher Tolkien, as an introduction to that chapter, "There is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn. And it must be admitted that there are severe inconsistencies embedded in the traditions. Or, to look at the matter from another point of view, that the role and importance of Galadriel only emerged slowly, and that her story underwent continual refashionings." One day, I'll do a full episode on the whole story of Galadriel and Celeborn's lives throughout the First Age, but I want to wait until I finished the First Age before doing that. Anyway, my point here is that there is no one correct way to imagine Galadriel and Celeborn's backstory. There are potentially incorrect ways, but if you choose to go with the version where they left Beleriand long before the end of the First Age and contributed very little to the action of the Silmarillion, you are obviously fully entitled to imagine things that way. That is kind of what Tolkien wrote. But if, like me, you think their story is a lot more interesting if they do play a meaningful role in the events of the Elder Days, I invite you to imagine Galadriel and Celeborn as supporting characters present in the background for much of what I'm going to talk about throughout this Silmaril of Doriath series. And if you do choose to include Galadriel and Celeborn in your headcanon here, I suppose we could speculate a little bit on what they were getting up to between their last actual appearance in the published Silmarillion and the events of this lost tale. As I've already said, in the actual Silmarillion, we are told Galadriel did not join her brother Fëanor Felagund in Nargothrond, for in Doriath dwelt Celeborn, kinsman of Thingol, and there was great love between them. Therefore she remained in the Hidden Kingdom, and abode with Melian, and of her learned great lore and wisdom concerning Middle-earth. Then Galadriel went to that great feast in Nargothrond to celebrate it being fully built. She talked to her brother about why he has no wife, and that is the last thing Tolkien ever tells us about her during the events of the Silmarillion. This feast took place in the year 102 of the First Age, and our Silmaril of Doriath series begins in the year 502, so that's exactly 400 missing years for us to speculate on. And when imagining Galadriel and Celeborn in those 400 years, the main place my mind goes to is their hypothetical relationships with the other characters of Doriath, who totally do all feature heavily in the Silmarillion. And first and foremost, I imagine Galadriel might have had a potentially beautiful relationship with her first cousin once removed on her mother's side, Luthien Tinuviel. Luthien is considerably older than Galadriel, she's considerably wiser, and her magic is considerably more powerful. But she is the daughter of Queen Melian, and Tolkien tells us Galadriel abode with Melian, and of her learned great lore and wisdom concerning Middle-earth. So it certainly stands to reason she and Luthien might have had a really close relationship. Perhaps Galadriel even saw Luthien as a sort of adoptive older sister figure in Doriath. And if this were the case, Galadriel would also be caught up in the grief of Luthien's decision to live a mortal life and eventually die, in a way that immortals can't really understand. By the time Luthien does die, Galadriel has already lost every single one of her brothers. But despite that, she's not quite sundered from them forever. After they die, their spirits return to the uttermost west, and in 6,500 years' time, right at the end of The Lord of the Rings, Galadriel will also sail into the uttermost west, and there she will be reunited with them. But Luthien, she passes with Beren beyond the circles of the world. Galadriel and Melian and Thingol will lose her in the most profound way that an immortal can. But then, only 5 years after Luthien made that decision to give up her immortality, Turin, son of Hurin, came to live in Doriath, only 8 years old. Perhaps during the 12 years that followed, as Turin journeyed from boy to man as a foster son of the king, he was known and loved by Galadriel and Celeborn. He was certainly known and loved by other big names among the Sindar like Beleg Cuthalion and Mablung of the Heavy Hand. And if Turin was known to Galadriel in Doriath, what about his mother and sister? Did Galadriel know Nienor? I sometimes like to imagine Galadriel had with Nienor the inverse of her relationship with Luthien. This time, Galadriel is the older, wiser, much more powerful super being of Doriath who welcomes the less experienced 21-year-old Nienor into the Hidden Kingdom and becomes a sort of adopted older sister figure. Perhaps she also had long chats with Nienor's mother, Morwen. Perhaps she tried to dissuade Morwen's stubborn behaviour, as we know other elves did. And maybe She and Celeborn were present in Thingol's hall when Húrin himself came to Doriath after taking the Nauglamir from the treasure hoard of Mime the Petty Dwarf. Perhaps she watched him cast that elvish necklace at her great-uncle's feet while insulting him. Perhaps she took solace as her mentor, Melian the Maya, cleansed Húrin's mind of Morgoth's shadow. Maybe she looked on in great sorrow as the tragedy of the children of Húrin unfolded before her eyes. And it's not just Galadriel who proves delightfully fertile soil for our imaginations to grow in. Speculating on her future husband is perfectly delightful too. As I've said, Celeborn the Wise is the great-nephew of the High King of the Sindar, Thingol. He's actually Galadriel's second cousin. They are both the grandchildren of one of Thingol's brothers. And this also means that Celeborn's great-aunt, by marriage, is a Maya. And we know for a fact that Grandpa Elmo was particularly close to Thingol. And considering that Thingol never had any sons of his own, I imagine he would have loved beloved Elmo's son, his nephew Galadhon, all the more for it. And surely he would have also deeply loved Elmo's first grandchild, Celeborn. I really enjoy imagining Celeborn when he was a relatively young Lord of the Sindar from a relatively large royal family in Doriath, and speculating on what kind of youth he might have had during the long years of starlight in his great-uncle's court. But I also really enjoy imagining Celeborn as a wise older brother to little bro Galadriel, and many years later as cool Uncle Celeborn to his young niece, Nimloth. I know I've not really introduced Nimloth yet, but imagine a young princess of the Sindar going to hang out with her Uncle Celeborn and being introduced to his new, special friend, a foreign princess of the Noldor called Galadriel, from across the sea. All of those names and familial relationships come from Tolkien, but their details and their stories weren't ever written down or fleshed out in his lifetime. And so we are forced to imagine what great shapes these textual ruins might have taken if Tolkien had finished the ending of his reimagined Silmarillion. If we view Chapter 22 as one chapter within a novel, it's hard not to argue this is the least juicy one. We're told about a lot of things, but we aren't really shown much of them happening. However, if we think of the story instead as the only surviving account of some lost event in Middle-earth's history that time has turned into legend and then retelling has made into myth, all of our problems evaporate. Real-world myths have all kinds of inconsistencies and contradictions and missing moments, but I feel like those things only heighten the profundity of the stories being told. I guess the truth is, no one knows what really happened in Doriath towards the end of the First Age, but we know the end result. We know who the players were, and we know a bit of what they did. It's just the meat and the muscle of the story that's moved into the realm of myth, and so it's up to all of us imagining that myth to build those details in our mind's eye. Anyway, that story, that mystery of what went down in Doriath, is what I'm super excited to spend the rest of this series, the next 7 episodes, talking all about. It's gonna be epic, it's gonna be emotional. I think some moments of this might make you angry, but most of all, it's going to be the most inspiring